Freedom begins with a book. This idea is powerful and is at the core of the work of an organization called Freedom Reads, a first-of-its-kind organization that uses literature to empower people to confront what prison does to the spirit by placing millions of books into prisons, one 500-book freedom library at a time, until they've opened one in every prison dormitory and housing unit in the United States. The Freedom Library and other literary initiatives support the efforts of people in prison to imagine new possibilities for their lives. The power of a book is also an idea that Jews for millennia have understood as part of the fabric of our being. There's a reason that we're known as the people of the book. Perhaps this is why when our congregant Debbie Muckamal invited me to join her to volunteer with her and her friends at Freedom Reads, I jumped at the chance and found myself spending this past Tuesday inside the correctional training facility in Soledad, also known as Soledad State Prison. Some of you may know that for the past 5 or 6 years, I've been leading our teens, mostly 11th and 12th graders, one of whom is here tonight, on a civil rights journey through the American South. And this past February, I led our first trip for adults, many of whom were parents of the teens who had joined me in years past. It's a powerful experience. We explore the history of the civil rights movement, traveling through Alabama. We visit Montgomery and Selma and Birmingham, and end our trip in Atlanta at Dr. King's family neighborhood and his church, Ebenezer Baptist Church. Over the course of the trip, we also consider the broader experience of Black Americans and people of color, and start to challenge some of the narratives of race, class, and privilege, and really interrogate the philosophy of white supremacy that developed over centuries of enslaving African people and their descendants, and then used to maintain a sense of fear and authority in the period of Reconstruction and the segregation laws of the Jim Crow South. Driving through these places, past cotton fields and warehouses where enslaved people were held before being sold in town squares, gives you a visceral connection to the history. I've run this trip 5 times now, and it affects me deeply each and every time. As part of the trip, we visit the Equal Justice Initiative's Legacy Museum and the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, the first monument to memorialize victims of racial terror lynchings throughout the American South. EJI was founded by Brian Stevenson, a lawyer who has dedicated his career to challenging excessive and unfair sentencing, exonerating innocent death row prisoners, confronting abuse of the incarcerated and the mentally ill, and aiding children prosecuted as adults, in addition to creating these 2 powerful sites of memory. Stevenson has been a powerful voice in challenging some of the assumptions of America's criminal justice system. Walking through the Legacy Museum, which lays out Stevenson's thesis that slavery in America didn't end, it evolved, you experience a story of the many horrors people with Black skin faced over the history of this country, all the way up through their overrepresentation in today's system of mass incarceration. There are 2 ideas that Stevenson conveys, both in these spaces, in talks, and in his book, Just Mercy, that always stay with me after encountering these narratives. One is on a magnet that hangs in my office. Each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. And the second, you cannot change the world if you don't allow yourself to get proximal to the challenge and the problems that you care about. After each of these trips, it's always a challenge to try to figure out the right next steps, how to bring what we've learned back home. Is it advocacy or volunteering or relationship building or something else? Much of it already overlaps with the various social justice initiatives at Beth Am that congregants are already working on. And I'm always struck by Beth Am's history of a commitment to the civil rights movement, and the many stories about Rabbi Axelrod and the time he spent putting his body on the line to advance the cause of civil rights. I always teach my teens when we're in Selma that we're following in Rabbi Axelrod's footsteps. But back in February, after returning from the adult civil rights trip, the participants and I began processing our trip and thinking collectively about various actions we might take, and also what more we needed to learn and read about the current state of race and these various systems in America in order to proceed in an informed way. So it's no surprise that when I was talking with Debbie, one of our Betham board members and someone who has dedicated her professional life to making enduring change in the criminal justice system, most recently as the executive director of the Stanford Criminal Justice Center at Stanford Law School, one of her suggestions for a concrete service opportunity was to bring some of our most recent trip participants to prison to volunteer with Freedom Reads. Which brings me back to this past Tuesday at the Soledad State Prison, installing Freedom libraries of 500 books each in 12 different housing units, 24 between the two groups there with Freedom Reads that day, and 36 if you count the additional 12 libraries that were installed by 3 other Betham volunteers on Monday at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla. Freedom Reads was founded by Reginald Dwayne Betts, a poet and Yale-educated lawyer who, before getting degrees in poetry and the law, served 9 years in prison. Dwayne is candid about his time in prison and about the crime that landed him there. But he also speaks powerfully about the transformative experience he had while in solitary confinement because of a book. He explains, "I survived solitary and rediscovered a sense of freedom the system had tried to beat out of me because of a book. I realized that a poem can give somebody a whole world of hope. And after reading that book, I dedicated myself to helping other prisoners and people outside of prison discover the freedom blueprint that poetry, literature, and other arts can provide." So on Tuesday, the other volunteers and I worked side by side with the Freedom Reads staff, including James, who would explain a bit about the library and its purpose and share his own story with the inmates after installing each library. James had just been released 8 months ago after serving 25 years in Angola prison in Louisiana. It was powerful to watch the inmates who we talked with as we installed each library, but who perhaps eyed us with a bit of trepidation, a look of, why are these people we don't know giving us books? Do they pity us? But when James would share his story and Dwayne's story, there was an immediate connection and a true sense of credibility and authenticity. This was not something an outsider was doing because they thought these inmates needed it. No, this was the project of people that had stood where they stood and understood the power that books could offer. As James would explain, a book can help you imagine a place or a world or a concept that your brain can't even begin to comprehend before reading that book, because it is so completely foreign to you. A book can help you imagine a different world, a different path, and perhaps provide a sense of hope. A book can also be an invitation to build community, providing a different kind of entry point into a conversation between two people who may have read the same book. And these freedom libraries aren't just a pile of books on rickety shelves. There's an understanding that so much of life in prison is made up of concrete and metal and straight lines. So Dwayne sought out craftsmen to fabricate solid wood bookshelves made of cherry and oak and walnut with a beautiful curve to them, taking each bookshelf off the U-Haul and bringing them into each housing unit, right in the center of where inmates eat and sleep and spend their days. That was the first thing that the residents would comment on, is just how beautiful these pieces of furniture were. The shop that Freedom Reads works with also makes a point of hiring people who have served time in prison, like James. The bookshelves themselves are a conversation piece, crafted with thoughtful intention, care, and love. The collection of books are also incredibly thoughtful and intentional, including contemporary works of fiction and nonfiction, classics like Homer's The Odyssey and the Iliad, books of poetry and philosophy. While Freedom Reads keeps the full list under wraps, I noticed a few Jewish authors as well, works by Philip Roth and Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem on the banality of evil. At the end of the day, the volunteers and Freedom Read staff went out to lunch at 4 o'clock. And over a delicious meal, we got to learn more about the broader efforts of the organization and the other prisons that they visited to install freedom libraries, around 150 so far. I also got the chance to sit with Dwayne and reflect on the day and get to know him a bit better. To say he's brilliant would be an understatement. I shared that it was really a unique opportunity to humanize a group of people who are so often in our society dehumanized, reduced to being identified by their crime. He pushed back, reminding me that they're always human. It reminded me of a Talmudic story in which Rabbi Meir's wife, Bruria, chastises him to be careful to avoid calling someone who has sinned a sinner, and rather distinguish the person and their action, referring to them as a person who has sinned rather than a sinner. As I thought about it, I realized that encountering these inmates on such a human level, in their living space, however complex, really went about undehumanizing them, creating opportunities for some powerful moments of human-to-human connection, even if fleeting. In talking about how much the day had affected me, I mentioned to him that I noticed Eichmann in Jerusalem, and we ended up having a deep conversation about Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning that he wrote while in a concentration camp. We talked about Frankl's message that even in the midst of unimaginable bleakness, humans have the capacity to find hope. He said he really resonated with that idea and how important it is to really internalize that idea and make it personal. This was a big part of what he's trying to do with Freedom Reads, to remind this group of people who some in society may have written off because of what they've done, that there is a world beyond the prison walls, and that sometimes hope can come from within yourself as well. At Beth Am and as Jews, we understand the power of a book, of access to imagination and information. Over the years, we've worked hard through our Equal Start initiative to create access and increase access to books and education for the youngest and most vulnerable residents of California, and have built libraries and resources for local preschools. A few years ago, we donated books that our library no longer needed to the California prison system. There is great power in a book, in study. As our tradition teaches, turn it and turn it again, for everything is in it. Shabbat Shalom. So we will continue.